But yeah, so first year PhD here. I'm gonna talk about the work I've done during my master's and also collaboration that I continued with Layer 6, which is a company that I also worked with for a while after my master's. So it's a collaboration with a lot of folks from University of Toronto, Vector Institute, and also Layer 6. And it's essentially viewing generative models through the manifold hypothesis and sort of getting some insights through this unique lens. And I was initially going to cover one of these papers, but you will see my hands waving around a lot because I'm going to give you more of like a high-level intuitive sort of view of 3 works rather than one, to sort of motivate why we actually care about this manifold hypothesis view and how it can be useful. So the outline is that we will just lay the ground, the notation that we're going to use, what is the manifold hypothesis, and then I'm going to start from a motivating example, which is pretty near and dear to me, and that kind of kick-started all of my, for me, that sort of like linked back in some strange way to the manifold hypothesis, and I'm going to give an overview of that. And then we see that through this practical lens, the notion of intrinsic dimension of a manifold pops up. And so for the next portion of the talk, estimating intrinsic dimension is going to be the most important problem in the world. And we're going to dive deep into that. And then we're going to come back up and see how we can leverage the intrinsic dimension for other problems on generalization, memorization, dichotomy, and that sort of stuff. Okay, so let's get started. So the manifold hypothesis, I'm sure you've already seen a version of this, which is that the reason why ML models are so successful, even when they're dealing with extremely high dimensional data, is that they have an intrinsic low dimensional structure to them. So the reason why we believe this is it's actually a hypothesis, but it's just a success of ML. And there are multiple versions of this. So like a very crude way of thinking about it is that all of your data lies on one manifold. That's not necessarily true. You might have clusters of data that have one certain structure, another cluster that has another certain structure. You might even have points that don't necessarily lie on either manifolds, or like they might lie on multiple structures at the same time. But for the purpose of this talk, we're gonna think about the stratified manifold hypothesis, or the union of manifold hypothesis, where we're essentially going to say that the manifold representation of data is essentially a union of a bunch of low-dimensional things. And this figure, it's a cartoon illustration that sort of is aimed at representing that. So let's say a very crude representation of MNIST images. We have a cluster of images of the digit 1, and these things lie on a 1D manifold, and the degree of freedom is like how much you tilt the digit. There's really not that many degrees of freedom with this cluster of data points. But for example, if you have a more complicated image like an 8, you might have the tilt, but you might also have another degree of freedom, which is, for example, the disproportionality of the upper and lower half, and then you have a higher dimensional manifold for this cluster of data points. So when I call something M the manifold, I essentially mean a union of a bunch of these manifolds. And an object of interest during this talk would be the local intrinsic dimension of M at a point X, which is essentially pick X, see what manifold it lies on, and then see what the intrinsic dimension of the manifold there is. And we're going to see how looking at this quantity is going to be useful. So the other thing is, generative modeling. And in generative modeling, you always have access to a bunch of samples from a ground truth distribution P star. And you have a generative model that's parameterized by theta, and you're trying to minimize some sort of the divergence between your parameterized probability distribution and your ground truth probability. This can be score matching, flow matching, maximizing likelihood, elbows, all sorts of stuff. But essentially, from these two distributions, we can define two different manifolds. One of them is the data manifold, which is the ground truth underlying structure that we don't actually have access to, but we're just going to call it a name, M. And then also the M theta manifold, which is the manifold induced by the model. And these are kind of like hand wavy arguments because you don't actually have access to these intrinsics. You have to actually define what these are in terms of the probability. But I'm gonna essentially argue thinking about these things and analyzing M theta and M is going to be useful in many scenarios. And in fact, analyzing M theta rather than analyzing M is sometimes easier because you essentially, with M, you essentially have a bunch of data points. You have like a point cloud. But with M theta, you have access to the whole distribution. You have a representation of what your M theta is. So you will see that we have two scenarios of interest. Sometimes we will assume that the model is perfectly fit on the data of interest, in which case M theta and M match. And in this case, studying the properties of M theta would lead to insights on the actual data distribution. And one nuanced case is when these things don't match on some specific data points. And in those cases, we will see that it gives some kind of interpretation on cases where these generative models tend to fail. So these are useful ways of thinking about this. And as I said, the way you define M theta and M are kind of like hand wavy as I presented it, because for the scope of this talk, I don't want to go into all of the formalities. But if you're interested in a more formal way of actually defining these things, you can kind of think about the distribution. Let's see where it concentrates exactly, and that's the manifold. For the intents and purposes of this talk, it's enough to kind of assume that. All right, so there's this very interesting paradox, and I'm not going to start off with the manifold hypothesis for this, because I think it's a really interesting thing that when you think about it and like view it from a purely probabilistic point of view, you essentially end up thinking about the manifold hypothesis. And the paradox is this paper from Naliznik, 2018, I believe. Do deep generative models know what they don't know? And this paper has a really interesting experiment where you pick your favorite generative model. In this case, it's a normalizing flow, and you train it on fashion MNIST data points. And then you faithfully generate clothes and pants and whatnot. So they are actually capturing the distribution data. And you do a weird thing where you pick MNIST digits that the model has never seen, and you estimate the likelihood of those unseen data points. And what ends up happening is that for the unseen data points, you actually get a higher likelihood compared to the in-distribution ones. And this isn't specific to fashion MNIST and MNIST, but it actually holds for CFAR10 SVHN, for ImageNet SVHN, and there are many other pairs in the literature that have been also found. And the whole thing is that this thing is also one-sided. So if I train a model on MNIST and I evaluate on fashion MNIST, I won't see this phenomenon happening again. So it's called, do deep generative models know what they don't know? Because they assign high likelihood to things that they shouldn't know, in a sense. And it's important to note that it's not specific to normalizing flows. If you actually estimate the log probabilities using like ODE solvers on diffusion models, or if you look at the elbows of a VAE, a similar phenomenon kind of happens. So when I was kind of like presented with this issue, it was like, well, how can this actually happen? Because you never generate these out of distribution data points. And for the domains that we're kind of interested in here, these are continuous domains. So the log likelihood, or the likelihood itself, is actually a probability density, not actually which is different from a probability mass. And you might conceivably have out of distribution regions that are that are kind of like zero measure compared to your in distribution region. And so conceivably, in principle, you might have a lot of density on these out of distribution regions, but since they don't integrate to a meaningful probability mass, they never get generated. So this makes sense, but how can we actually verify if this is the case? And you might ask the question, why the heck would we even have these probability densities? And I'm not going to go into the detail of why we're going to have these probability densities. There are some works on that which essentially say that all natural images, they have shared features, shared high frequency features, and as a byproduct of the inductive biases that we choose for our generative models, we are essentially learning a similar shared feature between all of these. So this is an artifact of your inductive biases that happens. Now the question is, when this artifact happens, can we sort of like verify if this is the case that's happening, if we have these like likelihood peaks and sort of the out of distribution region is a lower dimensional structure or not. So let's try to think about it a little bit. And rather than looking at probability densities, let's say I'm given a reference point x naught, and I want to integrate the probability density along a ball of radius r around that. And so pictorially here, let's say I have 3 different radii that I consider. For small radius, since the density for the out of distribution points is larger, I'm going to get a higher value here. However, as I increase the radius of this ball, I would argue that you would decay, the probability would decay much faster for the out of distribution regions compared to the in distribution regions. Because if it's not, then you'll have like a sizable probability volume, and you're integrating that, and it's still meaningful. So you're going to generate the out of distribution points, which is definitely not the case. So if we can for a given x naught and a given radius r, we can estimate this thing, then we're good. But unfortunately, we're dealing with extremely high dimensional probability landscapes, and estimating this thing is a classical case of the curse of dimensionality. So rather than estimating that, we can estimate a proxy of that. And this proxy, I would argue, is easier to evaluate. Notice that we can write this probability this probability value as an integral. And if you squint a little bit, this integral is actually a uniform convolution along that ball times the volume. And an interesting property in high dimensions, remember high dimensions was a bad thing, but now we can actually leverage the high dimensional property to replace this uniform convolution with a Gaussian. And in fact, there's this Gaussian annulus theorem, or Gaussian soap bubble, which essentially says if the dimensionality of your data is too high, then most of the probability mass is going to lie on a rate for a given Gaussian. It's going to lie on a ball of some radius around it, depending on the standard deviation. So if we pick our standard deviation such that these two things actually match, we can replace this uniform convolution with a Gaussian convolution here. And I'd argue that, so if we factor out let's say we're comparing out of distributions and in distributions for different radius, we can factor out the volume term, and we'll just call this Gaussian convolution as rho of x naught and delta. And this is going to be something that's going to pop up a lot. And in fact, we can estimate this much easier. And this is a simple experiment on the normalizing flow case for the fashion MNIST and MNIST model. In fact, you can estimate these rho x naught deltas for all of the in distribution and out of distribution data points for a normalizing flow. I'm not going to go into the detail of how we actually estimate this, but essentially what this figure shows is that if you sweep over different values of delta, and remember, small delta corresponds to small radius, large delta is a large log standard deviation, it's a larger radius, and that's the x-axis, and the y-axis is essentially take any reference data point in distribution or out of distribution, evaluate this value along different values of delta, and then compute the mean of that across all the in distribution points and the mean of that across the out of distribution points, and you end up with a figure like this. And since this thing is constructed from a Taylor series, you can't really trust the values after a certain point. But if we squint a little bit, this essentially shows us that this row quantity for the out of distribution points is decaying much faster for the in distribution points, which is in line with sort of the initial intuition that we have for the probability volume argument. Now let's take a step back and think about this this quantity. And there's this really interesting theorem that relates the rate at which the Gaussian convolutions change for a point to the local intrinsic dimension of the data. And the argument, it's actually rigorously proven by the paper I've linked here. The argument intuitively is that it's kind of represented here. Let's say I have a 2D ambient space, and D here is the ambient space dimension. Let's say I have a 2D ambient space, and I have a manifold of dimension 2 and a manifold of dimension 1. And I sort of increase delta from right to left and plot the probability, the rho x and delta values, which are probability densities after adding more and more Gaussian noise. What happens is that if I look at, for example, the center here, you can see that for the lower dimensional structure, after delta equals 4, the whole probability density kind of like vanishes or like smooths out much faster than the 2D case. So this is kind of the intuition to have in mind, that the rate at which this changes does actually depend on the local intrinsic dimension, and it depends through this formula here. So I'd argue that we can replace that rate thing that we had, which was kind of artificial, and come up with a hypothesis that the local intrinsic dimension for out of distribution points is actually less than the in distribution points. And this is for a manifold induced by the model and not by the data itself. Because remember, the model actually learns a manifold for some reason on the out of distribution points. If you're thinking about the local intrinsic dimension of data, this thing is like ill-defined. So this is sort of like looking at it from a probabilistic perspective, then like thinking about it in terms of local intrinsic dimension. This is an intuition. You can throw all of that aside and formulate a hypothesis, which is what we did essentially for our paper, is that so the hypothesis that we came up is that when you train a generative model on a relatively high dimensional manifold, the model also learns some low dimensional structure on the out of distribution region as well. And these out of distribution regions might obtain high likelihood values or high probability densities. However, when the out of distribution region has a lower dimensional structure compared to the in distribution region of the manifold, if you integrate along that out of distribution region, you're going to get a zero measure compared to the in distribution portion. And if you think about it a little bit, this can also explain why the paradox is one-sided. If I train the model on MNIST and I integrate and I have high densities along all of fashion MNIST and I integrate along all of fashion MNIST and I still get a high integral, then I will probably generate from fashion MNIST too. And that's not going to be the case. So the reason why it's one-sided is that it depends on the local intrinsic dimension, and it's in the side where the local intrinsic dimension is higher in a sense. So this kind of motivates us to estimate these model-induced local intrinsic dimensions. And at the time that we were writing this paper, there was only one LID estimator for diffusion models, which we used, and there were multiple for normalizing flows. And what ended up happening is that we came up with the world's laziest way of doing out of distribution detection, which is pick a threshold on your likelihood, pick a threshold on your intrinsic dimension, and call a data point in distribution if it has likelihood more than that threshold and it has a local intrinsic dimension more than that threshold too. And for example, here a Gaussian noise is out of distribution compared to MNIST, because even though it's like almost all of your space, it has high intrinsic dimension, it has low likelihood. And MNIST is also out of distribution because even though it has higher probability densities, it has lower intrinsic dimension. And it turns out that this method of doing out of distribution detection is really good compared to a lot of other baselines at the moment. And this was our paper, and also this is a scenario where remember at the beginning of the talk I was telling you that sometimes the discrepancy between the model-induced manifold and the actual data manifold leads to insights about the properties of generative models. This is an example of that, and perhaps it's kind of a not the most obvious example. Yeah. So for this portion of the talk, LIDs are going to be the most important topic, and we're going to try to estimate them using generative models. And note that there are actually a lot of estimators for local intrinsic dimension, but there are way fewer estimators that rely on a generative model to do that. So you can kind of categorize these estimators into model-free and model-based. The model-free ones, essentially what they do is that there's this very simple estimator, which essentially does a k-nearest neighbor for every point, and then does a PCA and looks at the explained variances, puts a threshold on them, and the number of explained variances above that threshold is the local intrinsic dimension. That's an example of an estimator, which is called LPCA. But there are way fewer model-based estimators. And I would argue that this problem in and of itself is actually an interesting ML problem, especially in the modern era, because we don't necessarily have access to all of the data that's been used to train a model. But like say, I give you a stable diffusion, you can query it, you can even have the parameters, but you don't have access to the data that it's been trained on. But I would argue that you can still do still do geometric inference of the underlying data, because you have access to even more. You have access to the entire parameters that define the whole likelihood landscape. So you have access to M theta. And for this portion of the talk, we're gonna focus on points where the local intrinsic dimension for the true manifold is similar to that of the model manifold. And what better generative model to think about than diffusion models, which we already know are state of the art for image generation, for example, and many continuous domains. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of score-based diffusion models, because we're going to leverage these stochastic differential equations to come up with an estimator that's pretty efficient. So diffusion models, they're defined via a forward stochastic differential equation, which essentially you have your data, you run it through this SDE, and it turns data into noise. And what you learn is to invert this process. The forward process is defined through this. You have your drift function f, your diffusion coefficient g, and your Wiener process term. And essentially, all of the diffusion models that you care about, they play around with this like drift coefficient or the diffusion coefficient and the drift function. And what ends up happening is that given a forward SDE, you can define, you can formulate the conditional probability of xt given x naught, xt given x at time 0 using a Gaussian. And everything that's kind of color-coded in blue, you can analytically write it out So pick your favorite diffusion model, it's going to have a different psi or sigma value. And another notation of importance is the marginal distributions, which we're going to denote by PT. These are what happens to your probability density as you push it through this forward SDE. And P of 0 is going to be the data distribution. P of 1 is typically a Gaussian distribution. And score-based diffusion models, they essentially learn the score, which is the gradient of the log marginal probability. There's the conditional score matching objective, and what ends up happening is that when it's optimal, it converges to this thing, which we call the score. And the whole point is that once you have this score function, you can invert this SD, come up with another SD that runs backward in time, and it's formulated using this, and the score function pops up here. So since your neural net has actually learned this, you can run an ODE solver and invert this process to get your samples. So when we were thinking about local intrinsic dimension estimation with diffusion models, there was only one method out there, and it wasn't really amenable for stable diffusion scale diffusion models. And what it did was actually a really smart and simple observation, which is when you look at the time scales and you send the t to 0, what happens with your diffusion model is that it turns into a projection onto the manifold at times close to 0. And so in principle, if you're given a reference point and you want to estimate the local intrinsic dimension, you can k times noise it out a little bit, and then see the score function, what direction the score function points at, and bundle them up to like create the span of that space. And that space is going to be orthogonal to your manifold. And d minus that dimension will give you the dimension of the tangent space. So running this requires noising out k times and then creating a massive matrix and doing an SVD decomposition, which is which isn't really feasible for like extremely high resolution diffusion models like stable diffusion. So it seemed like an interesting research problem to do this efficiently at that point, and we knew that these LIDs, they have some interesting properties that might be of interest to. So what we did is that we went back to the whole like rho x delta thing, and the whole like argument that as you send delta to negative infinity, this thing converges to the local intrinsic dimension minus d. And we said that, yeah, this is exactly the diffusion process. There's like a very intuitive way that you can think about these like Gaussian convolutions as essentially snapshots of time for a diffusion process. It's just that you're reparameterizing things. Instead of delta, you have a time associated with that delta. So so our estimator is called flipped because it uses the Fokker-Planck equation to estimate LID. And what it does is that you can actually come up with this identity that relates these log rho values, which we know relate to LIDs, to the marginals and also these terms here. The stuff in blue, you can analytically write it out for any diffusion model. And then we know as delta goes to negative infinity, the gradient of this with the partial derivative of this with respect to delta converges to LID minus D, D being the ambient dimension again. And so we plug the formula on top here. We also apply a chain rule to be in the time domain. So rather than taking the gradient with respect to delta, we take the gradient with respect to time and apply the chain rule, and then expand this. And notice that this term on the right here, this is actually the well-known Fokker-Planck equation. And you can actually write this in terms of the spatial derivative of the log marginal probability. And if you do a little bit of like calculation, which I'm going to omit here, you end up with this simplification of the LID, which is as delta goes to negative infinity, the LID is equal to this term here. And notice that the gradient of the log probability is the score. So we've already learned these things using our our score-based generative model. So we can essentially replace those terms, and we'll end up with this formula. Yep.
Maybe I missed this, but how do we know the ambient dimension?
We know that our diffusion is learned on like a specific resolution, so we know D already. Yeah, so this term might be a little bit intimidating, but I argue this is actually very efficient to estimate. So first off, you have a hyperparameter delta, and in theory land, you have to send this to -infinity. In practice, you just set it to a small value. All of the terms here in blue, you can actually evaluate it. So pick your favorite diffusion model. It's going to have a transition kernel parameterized by psi and sigma. So these are easy to compute. Then you essentially have this input. You run it through your score function. For the L2 term, you can just evaluate L2. The other term is this trace of the Jacobian of the score. And this actually pops up a lot in ML. And well, you can estimate trace using the Hutchinson estimator. And when you estimate this using Hutchinson, you have to evaluate a bunch of like V transpose gradient of score V. And those things you can evaluate efficiently using Jacobian vector products. So estimating this thing is actually very simple in terms of like with the AutoGrad tools that we already have. You essentially have to evaluate a bunch of JVPs. Question?
Yeah, how sensitive is this estimator to noise in Hutchinson's estimator? Like, how many samples do you need in practice for this to be good?
Great question. So the regime where this thing actually matters is when delta is small. Okay. And this gradient of score is almost diagonal in that regime. And the Hutchinson trace estimator, that turns out to be the case where the Hutchinson estimator is really good when your matrix is almost diagonal. Okay. The variance, you can compute the variance, and it's I think it's related to the sum of the values that are off diagonal, which is coincidentally very small. So essentially, you do a bunch of JVPs, and you set your hyperparameter delta, and you get a value. It's not even like an integer, but in theory, it should converge to an integer, which is your local intrinsic dimension. And the implications of this is that, well, we can try this with a pre-trained diffusion model too. And that's what we did. We took stable diffusion, set the prompt to like null, and then we took Lion 2B images and ran them through the estimator, and then we sorted them because we don't have access to the actual LID. What the best that we can do is to see if they can like order the images in a meaningful fashion. So on the top, you can see the smallest LID values from our Lion 2B dataset, and on the bottom, you can see the highest values. And mind you, this is a 1 million dimensional probability landscape. So we actually use a single JVP, and the single JVP gives us this ordering. And we also have a section on like, I think like 50 JVPs is probably the one that gives you the best estimate. But this is really cool because now you've unlocked the capability of estimating something that's actually theoretically grounded for extremely high resolution images. And we can do the same thing for like MNIST, for like all these SVHN, fashion MNIST, CFAR, and we can also do it on synthetic manifolds. So you take you define a synthetic manifold, you sample data from it, you train a diffusion model on that, and then estimate LID. This is like the world's most complicated way of getting your LID. But if you compare the values that you get from our algorithm, it's actually quite competitive. I wouldn't argue it's the best, but after you've trained your diffusion model, it gives you estimates pretty quick. One other thing that we did is that we saw that these values, they actually correlate a lot with the PNG compression rate, which is like a side experiment, which was cool. And it was also differentiable. So I'm still thinking about like a research problem that might come out of that. And most importantly, we now have a way to estimate LIDs for large-scale diffusion models. So if you want to run the normal bundle estimator, which was the one that I talked about on Lion, it took like 3 days, and then we just ended the run because it was taking forever. And it also takes a lot of memory as well. Okay, so this is kind of our deep dive into local intrinsic dimension estimation. Hopefully through the first example, I've kind of given you a hand-wavy argument that these things are interesting. But it turns out that these things are very interesting for a very relevant problem in generative modeling, which is the memorization and generalization dichotomy. And just to give an overview, we have these massive models, but sometimes when you give it specific prompts, they essentially copy the same data that they've been trained on. And this creates a lot of lawsuits and issues for model developers. And the cases where memorization happen isn't necessarily as, it isn't just copying. For example, on the bottom, sometimes the model memorizes the scene, but the painting on top of the scene is kind of a degree of freedom. But it's still, one can argue that this can be you can do a copyright claim here because the scene is already memorized. And the whole argument here is that it's not really clear how to define these generalizations, and it's a little bit hard to think about them. And so we kind of looked at it from a manifold hypothesis perspective, and we thought about the mismatch between m theta and m. So in principle, if you actually learn the true model manifold, you won't have memorization. Maybe if I skip to this, so if the blue curve, which is overlaid by the red one, and you probably can't see, but if the blue curve is our true manifold, and the red curve is the manifold that we learn, m theta, if these two actually match, then we're good. There's no memorization. However, it might be the case that you copy a bunch of data points here. You might regurgitate them, but for the rest of of your distribution, you don't actually do that. So here, for example, if you look at these points, these are point masses, and this is a mismatch between m theta and m. And here, if you evaluate the local intrinsic dimension, it will give you a value of 0 in these cases. But there might be more complicated versions of memorization where, for example, let's say for these 3 points, you learn a manifold and you learn some notion of interpolation between them, but the interpolation isn't, it's not necessarily the whole space, and it's along one axis of degree of freedom. Kind of intuitively, it's similar to the scene example I showed, which is the scene is kind of the same across all of them, but there's an axis of degree of freedom, which is the painting on the wall. So we kind of try to define memorization through the manifold hypothesis and local intrinsic dimension sense, and we said that a data point we consider as memorized if the model-induced LID that we can now estimate is less than the actual manifold LID that we will get from M. So LID of m theta of x is less than LID of m of x.
Hello.
Yep.
Why would it be great if they're two match exactly? Why would that be no memorization? Wouldn't that be that I can, the wave example, I would actually give you back the wave because I know exactly where the data.
So the data that we're given are these samples, right?
Right.
And if you've actually learned this, so from these crosses, these blue dots, you've actually learned the whole smooth thing. So you can interpolate along all of the axes of interest. And this is in fact what we want. This is perfect interpolation. So I guess to answer your question, you don't actually have access to the blue thing. You have access to these samples, and the fact that you can recover the blue thing is perfect. Questions?
Sorry, but then if you give the same query as the data was labeled, then you get the same.
The same query as the data was labeled. What do you mean by the label?
I mean that the great case of Kanagawa, it's labeled like this in the training.
Yeah. So for this, let's forget about the conditional diffusion models, which take a prompt as an input. We're just thinking about estimating on conditional probability density.
Okay.
And then if you want to think about conditional probability densities, then this space would be put the prompt in and generate multiple pictures out of that.
Okay.
Or if you have like in your data set, you somehow have access to all of these pairs that have the same prompt. Okay, so notice that now we can evaluate things that kind of represent the local intrinsic dimension. And what ended up happening is that when you estimate the Fokker-Planck LID for stable diffusion, you get much smaller numbers for the memorized data points compared to the non-memorized data points. Coincidentally, we also realized that that this is the case where the estimator actually fails a lot. So this is a case where the estimator you can see a bunch of like negative values here. So it's really not estimating LID. It's like estimating something that's not LID, but it's still useful because you can use that. But when we use, for example, smaller scale generative models, we get values that are actual LIDs, and this is also an open thing. But the point here is that the LIDs that we get for the memorized points from this estimator is actually less than the ones that we get from the non-memorized points. And one other experiment that we did is that so the LID estimator from Fokker-Planck, the formula that I showed, is actually fully differentiable. So what you can do is that given a prompt, you can find out the tokens that attribute mostly to the value of the local intrinsic dimension being low. And then when you visualize the attributions, for example, in this prompt, a painting of the Great Wave of Kanagawa, you'll see some of these tokens having large values, and the green ones are what we get with our LID estimator, and the other two are from other irrelevant methods that try to do a similar thing. But what we ended up doing is that this is like really kind of like an engineered way of mitigating memorization. But what you can do is that you can use GPT to perturb those tokens so that the content of the semantic content of your prompt doesn't change that much, but you flip the token to something that's equivalent. Like for example, talks on the precepts and Buddhist ethics, it generates a memorized image, but then we see that the talks is, for example, one of the tokens that attribute a lot. So we replace that with discussions about precepts and Buddhist principles, and then now it actually generates a data point that's not memorized. So useful things we can do. And yeah, sort of the conclusion of this talk is that through these works, hopefully I've kind of convinced you that looking at the manifold hypothesis from this like generative model angle is it's kind of a useful thing to do, because then the m theta and m, they don't match, they reveal some interesting properties of your generative model, and when they do match, you come up with good estimates of the property that you're thinking about. In this case, out of distribution or memorization, generalization. And intrinsic dimension is one such metric that you can define on your manifold. But for example, more interesting metrics might be defining curvature, finding geodesic model-induced geodesic distances between different points, and you can do that in a fully model-free manner. Or you can assume that you have access to a generative model that knows the data distribution and try to estimate similar things. So that's the direction that I'm thinking about a lot for my PhD. And one more thing is that if we can come up with these estimators, and if they're differentiable, and for example, in the case of the local intrinsic dimension, can we plug them back into the training procedure such that we also enforce the m theta and m to match, so that we have a better model which is more faithful to the manifold of the data. But yeah, with that being said, this ends the presentation.
Do we have any questions for a speaker?
So I understand you did this intrinsic dimensionality query, but what if your neural network is kind of simple, like an MLP or something? Like you can I guess there are simpler ways of like estimating the dimension of the model, like local dimension of the model.
What do you mean by MLP as a generative model?
No, not as a generative model. Just I'm saying, forget about generative models, like other neural networks, like MLPs or something. And we're interested still in their local intrinsic dimensions. Is there a way of like?
So the local intrinsic dimension of the parameters or the data? Because there are actually a lot of works on sort of like estimating, like taking the parameters of your MLP and then estimating the intrinsic dimension, and that reveals some properties of the latent space of your model. What I'm personally very interested in, in principle, when you have a generative model, is it has access to the full thing, like everything on your data. If you kind of like assume that, oh, well, my generative model is perfectly fit, you have that. So my interest is doing like extracting the information out of that. But so what is the case where these like MLP parameters might be?
I think I need to think more to formulate it, like where the, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a.
Okay, I have a quick question. So besides like the memorization, generalization,
yeah,
and like the future work about the principal estimation.
Yeah.
Right now, what people like, why would somebody would like to estimate the local intrinsic dimension? Like, is there a use cases application?
Yeah, that's I mean, actually, there are some works that try to they essentially claim that the AI generated content has lower intrinsic dimension compared to ground truth content, and this is from NLP actually. It's like very non-related to this field, but if you have some way of estimating the intrinsic dimension of your like token space, and then you can say, oh, this like the generated content, this content that I'm given here, it has suspiciously low intrinsic dimension. So this is probably an AI generated content. There's also for like adversarial attack detection, I think you can do a similar thing. But yeah, there are like, I've seen a few papers that do that too. Yep.
In terms of alternative estimators, I wonder if this is something that's been done. So you mentioned that at very small noise scales, you can think of the score as like a projection on a manifold. And if I'm not mistaken, you can estimate the dimension of the manifold then by like taking an SVD of that Jacobian and looking at its singular values. And I guess that would be super costly if your Jacobian's really big. But there are randomized SVD algorithms that just require JPPs. And I think for like one of the popular ones out there, there are proofs that if you have like an a priori bound on the rank of that Jacobian, you only need like a few extra noise samples relative to that. So you can imagine like if you think the dimensionality is low, then you can prove you need very few.
That's very cool. Like let's talk about that, because that also extends to like flow matching cases too.
Right. Yeah.
Let's chat about that. Yep.
One of the questions I had is like there's a big ongoing debate, I guess, of like about like what makes diffusion model generalized, and like people say it's data, people say it's architecture, addictive bias, and so on. Have you tried to use all this machinery to kind of like, give your opinion on not your opinion, but like throw a conclusion in this direction? Because you haven't really mentioned which architectures you're using, or like if you've seen some specific trends depending on how data itself is presented to the network or something like this, where you would, like, for example, you would have like, you train the same network with like different submodes of the data, and you see how it affects how it's going to learn it's different type of, like, for example, if you were to chunk your data sets in multiple chunks, will it learn the same intrinsic dimensionality as you would do with other things, or like stuff like this,
Yeah, I've omitted actually a lot of like this last work is mostly practical work, but I've omitted a lot of things on experiments that we done with essentially like different data scales, learning and diffusion on small data and larger data. So there might be relevant stuff there, but I don't have like a clear answer
Some
right
people
now.
vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned like using this to like detect whether something's like AI generated, because you said that like the lid is sometimes lower on
Yeah.
AI generated images. Do you have to have access to the model? Because it's like because it's like one thing if you're like, oh, I take stable diffusion, I have a stable diffusion model, I can test if like this is in or out of distribution of it. And if you had only the stable diffusion model and you had some AI generated image from some other model, are you able to say anything or like
Yeah,
predict
that's
anything
a
about
good
it?
question. I would argue that like this paper by I think like Philip Isola, it's like about the Platonic representation that all models kind of like converge in representation to something. If you bring that argument, maybe you can argue that all insights I get from this model also generalizes to insights I get from that. But beyond a ham baby argument, I don't have anything. Yeah.
I had a different question because I keep thinking of these images as like I first choose a discretization of like recording these images like 1K by 1K, right? And I get like some dimension of this like image of the trees or something. But what if I keep changing this dimension, like keep increasing it, for example, right? What is the proportionality of like the dimension of this picture of the trees versus like the total resolution of my image, right? Like, can I learn something truly about like the continuous signals here, like, or is it just relative to the discretization that I originally had?
So here everything is like finite dimensional and relative to the discretization, but I personally thought about that a lot. You have to deal with models that can work with these infinite dimensional cases, like I don't know, like nerves or like some of the other stuff that we were talking about the other day. But like in principle, you can probably like get an estimator out of those two, and it would be really cool that if I double the discretization, I get the same estimate of local intrinsic dimension for the.
So has there been any study on this?
No,
Or just
no,
like the same continuous signal, just discretized and analyzed?
No, I mean like local intrinsic dimension is not really a famous topic, and it's just this rabbit hole that I'm.
It's a very good rabbit hole.
But yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah.
So if you like convolve your data distribution with like a little bit of Gaussian noise, then local intrinsic dimension should be just big D.
Yeah.
So I imagine there are situations where like your data distribution does have like some noise on it.
Yeah.
But this thing probably doesn't break down entirely in that situation. But is there like a theoretical reason why that's the case or no?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like if you actually want to formalize these things, you run into a lot of trouble. Like for example, for diffusions, you can say that you have a probability that's supported on your intrinsic space, and then you have a probability that's on your extrinsic space. And if you want to formalize this thing, you will essentially say that as t goes to 0, this thing weakly converges to the this probability distribution weakly converges to the other probability distribution. But like in reality, the model is learned on noisy data. For some reason, it learns to like denoise that stuff. And like there's like this big disconnect when you think about it in theory land, and then you come up with an estimator, and then it just works for some reason. And I don't have like a clear view of why that's the case. But yeah, if you have any ideas.